My name is Alice Carter. I'm 37 years old, living in Chicago, and currently working for a government office. Or at least that's what my family believes. On the day my father passed away, I stood silently at the gates of the funeral home, dressed in a plain black coat, when my own sister stopped me. Mom doesn't want you inside. This is a service for family. They slammed the door shut, as if I had never existed. Have you ever been denied the right to say goodbye simply because someone decided you weren't worthy? Have you ever lived behind a curtain of misunderstanding, constantly underestimated, while the truth was something they could never even imagine? If you've ever been dismissed by your own flesh and blood, leave a comment below. Hit like if you've ever had to carry the weight alone just to keep the peace. And don't forget to subscribe because after they shut the door on me, a secret buried for 12 years began to surface. I don't quite remember when I first started feeling invisible in my family. Maybe it was one winter morning when I was still little, shivering in a worn-out blue school uniform, holding my first A-grade essay in my hand. I rushed to my mother, eyes bright with hope, wanting her to read it, the way she used to read Lana's essays, gushing over every word, reading aloud, and pinning them on the fridge with a heart-shaped magnet. But she just glanced at mine and said quietly, "That's good, honey. Now help me rinse the greens." I was the middle child, caught between two whirlwinds named Lana and Jake. Lana was the embodiment of academic excellence, scholarships from elementary through college, the star of every family photo, red lipstick, perfect smile. My younger brother Jake was born with athletic talent. He played baseball like he was destined for ESPN. And me, I liked to read. I liked sitting for hours in the corner of the living room, collecting tiny puzzle pieces from books and building a world of my own. My father, a retired colonel, valued discipline, image, and honor. He didn't raise his voice often, but his looks were enough to make me feel inadequate, especially when he nodded proudly at Lana or threw an arm around Jake in front of guests. With me, he'd usually just ask, "Have you thought this through? Pick a more practical major." I once dreamed of studying literature, but after seeing the disappointment in my mother's eyes and hearing my father's cold-as-steel voice say, "That won't feed anyone," I fell silent. I chose criminology, not to rebel, but because I was obsessed with truth. I wanted to understand what made people lie, betray, and hurt each other, but I never told anyone in the family, because I knew no matter what I studied, they wouldn't care. When I graduated, I quietly held my diploma outside the auditorium, standing alone amid a sea of hugging, picture-taking families. Lana was at a conference in New York. Jake had a regional semifinal to train for. My parents never even called. Not one congratulatory message. I didn't cry, I just stayed quiet, like I had learned to be for over 20 years. After graduation, I received an email from an unfamiliar federal address. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but the subject line stopped me cold. "We've reviewed your academic work and thesis. This is a special invitation to collaborate." I thought it was a prank. Then came the background checks, closed-door interviews, and just weeks later, I was brought to a training facility deep in the Virginia woods. No one in my family knew. They still believed I worked in some county office, photocopying documents all day. When I was assigned to the FBI's counterintelligence unit, my father once sat at the dinner table, tapping his fingers on the newspaper, asking pityingly, "Have you tried applying for a secretary job at your sister's firm?" And I just smiled. In the months that followed, as I went undercover at a financial firm investigating federal money laundering, I kept up my image of a regular person. I lived in a small rental near the docks, cooked my own meals, and spent nights decrypting financial records. Some nights I didn't sleep at all, tracing cash trails from offshore accounts in Belize to New Jersey. I'd been tailed. I'd received threatening letters. I'd had to change apartments overnight, but no one in my family knew. They still sent pictures from Lana's birthday parties, golf course meetups, Jake's appearances on local TV. I lay quietly in my tiny rented room, staring at the blinking lights outside the window, telling myself, "You chose this. No one needs to know." I once tried to tell them, One Christmas 4 years ago, I came home, sat down to dinner with my parents. I tried to open up, to say I wasn't just an office clerk. But the moment I began, my father cut in with a joke. Busy with what job? You're nearly 30 and still a nobody. My mother stayed quiet. Lana was live streaming a cocktail party. I went silent again and swallowed my story. I didn't need their applause. But I wanted to be heard, just once. I bought my first apartment in Lincoln Park with the bonus from a 9-month-long operation. It was small, quiet, with a window facing the lake. The day I moved in, I called my mother, hoping to invite her over, but she said she was busy prepping a gala for the Honor Society teachers group. The call ended with her absent-minded comment, "It's just a rental anyway. Don't stress too much about money." I hung up, then stepped out to the balcony. The wind hit my face. Below, the city glowed like no one was standing there, in silence at all. And I had gotten used to that, used to being forgotten, underestimated, seen as someone not worth remembering. But I stayed right in the heart of Chicago, quietly working through files where one misplaced comma could cost dozens of lives. I didn't need their recognition, but a part of me still hoped that someday they would see I wasn't as invisible as they thought. And I never imagined that day would come in the way it did. I was in the middle of tracking money flow through a network of shell companies in Arizona when the name Carter suddenly popped up in a confidential banking file tied to a trust in the Cayman Islands. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Carter isn't a rare name. But when I dug deeper, through 3 layers of proxies and ID verifications, I froze. The account holder was Thomas A. Carter, retired with the rank of Brigadier General, born in Rockford, Illinois. Date of birth matched my father's. I sat stunned in front of the screen, palms cold. The blinking line in the internal report felt like it was mocking me. Principal amount, $1.3 million. Source unknown. Monitored period 2016 to 2020. Indirect links to suspected inflated defense contracts. My father had retired before that time frame, but I knew he still had close ties in the military. He used to brag about honor banquets, advisory panels, and how he was the star of post-service conferences. I remember once he scoffed, talking about an old buddy deployed to Afghanistan as a logistics supervisor. That guy made bank after coming home. Didn't need a promotion, just knew where to funnel the money. I used to think it was just his usual swagger, nothing more. But now, I couldn't look away. I didn't report it immediately, in fact. I hesitated for 3 weeks. I kept tracking in silence, gave the case a code name, Gray Falcon. Every night, I reopened the files, matched flight logs, extracted surveillance images from veterans' dinners, flagged odd transactions from related accounts. Every step felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to be the one to expose my own father, the man who taught me to stand tall when falsely accused, who framed the words honor, duty, country above our front door. But at the same time, I couldn't look away. I'm an agent. My job is to uncover the truth, even if it hurts. Then one Wednesday afternoon, while I was reviewing a series of transfers linked to a media company called Luminosphere, another familiar name appeared, Lana Carter. My sister. The media called Lana a rising voice of policy-driven communication, the mastermind behind social campaigns for nonprofits. But I found in the funding files that her firm received hundreds of thousands of dollars from an entity called Northern Access Coalition. Harmless sounding, but actually a front for a foreign-backed media influence network. I triple-checked everything. The grant came from a tech firm in Moldova, routed through Canada, and landed in Lana's account a year ago. The documents weren't outright illegal, but they raised major ethical flags, and potential legal ones if brought to light. I stepped away from the screen and leaned against the window. The sky over Chicago had turned to ash gray, with the last rays of sunlight struggling through layers of thick clouds. The apartment was silent, save for the sound of my own breathing echoing in my chest. Why was my father tied to shady financial flows? Why did Lana accept sponsorship from a shell organization without checking the source? Or did they already know everything and choose silence for the sake of gain? I didn't dare ask, and I couldn't tell my colleagues either. If I reported it, the file would be flagged as a high-level internal investigation, and I'd be pulled off the case. I couldn't let that happen. Not yet. I chose to keep watching from the shadows, quietly, just a little longer. Every day I walked into the FBI office like nothing had changed. After hours, I gathered evidence, mapped out connection charts, recorded Lana's meetings whenever the sponsors were mentioned. A week later, while flipping through Luminosphere's tax records, I found an unusual expense labeled Strategic Consulting Partner. That partner was a small, newly opened company under the name of my father's former teammate, the one who appeared in several photos taken at award ceremonies, the one my father used to talk to for hours on the phone after dinner. My chest tightened. Each puzzle piece was closing the gap between suspicion and truth. I remembered the last time I saw my father, a few months before he passed. We stood on the porch in the fall air. His voice was gentler than usual. "Don't ever think I didn't see your effort. I know you're not like Lana or Jake, but you have a clear head, and that head can save lives." I hadn't understood why he said that. Now I did. He knew I'd uncover it, and maybe he wanted me to. I looked again at the financial network chart glowing on my computer screen. Among the hundreds of arrows, familiar names were beginning to overlap, as if fate had already written the story. And I realized that to see this through, I would have to trade more than just skill. I'd have to stake what little trust I had left in this world. I was at my desk at the federal office, finalizing a report on a suspicious transaction in Indiana when the phone rang. The name on the screen made my heart stall. Mom. Over the last 6 years, aside from a few polite holiday texts, she'd never called me directly. I hesitated for a second, then picked up. "Alice, it's Mom." Her voice was soft, slightly trembling. "I'm turning 70 next week. The whole family is preparing a small party at Lake View. I want you to come." I held the silence for a few seconds, the sound of keyboards clacking, printers whirring, all faded into the background. "Why now?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. "Because I think it's time. After all, you're still my daughter." It didn't sound real. It felt scripted, like a line from a party invitation recited out loud. But a part of me still wanted to believe this might be an opening. Not for forgiveness, but to see if there was any sincerity left. "I'll come," I said simply. That night, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. In my line of work, choosing an outfit was never an issue. But picking a dress to wear into a place once called home, a place where I was always the outsider, I didn't know where to start. I chose a simple gray dress with a clean cut at the collar and shoulders, just enough to blend in among the elegant crowd, but not too flashy. I tied my hair up, did light makeup, and kept the sharp look I wore for interrogations, not homecomings. The Uber stopped in front of the Lakeview mansion at 7 p.m. December in Chicago bit through skin like ice, but the house glowed with light like a holiday cathedral. I stepped through the gate, hand clutching my purse, reminding myself to stay composed, no matter what happened. Jake answered the door. My younger brother looked at me for a moment, his expression unsure, somewhere between surprise and awkwardness. "Oh, Alice, you really came," he said, slightly stiff. "I was invited," I replied quietly, stepping in without waiting for him to move. The house was filled with the scent of orchids and champagne, guests dressed in luxury, soft string music playing from the corner. I recognized some relatives, a few of Mom's friends, and of course, Lana, standing center stage with a glass of wine in hand, hair styled to perfection, her red dress like something out of a fashion magazine. Her eyes swept past me, paused for 1 second, then moved on. As if I were the help. Mom appeared at the stairs, hand in hand with her new husband, a salt and pepper-haired man I'd only seen in photos. She saw me, her lips curving into a fleeting smile. Alice, you made it, she said, walking over to hug me like greeting an old acquaintance. Happy birthday, I said, handing her a small gift. A silver photo frame, inside a picture I'd reprinted from when our family was whole, when I was around 10. She took it, nodded, and turned to greet another guest. I walked to a quiet corner, got a glass of water, and watched the room. No one came to talk. No one looked surprised or glad. It was as if I were a stranger passing through. Around 8 p.m., Jake stood up and clapped to get everyone's attention. Everyone, let's quiet down for a moment. Tonight's little party has a special feature. He turned on a projector. A video played. Old photos and clips from Lana's childhood, her public speaking competitions, media awards, Jake in his sports uniform, winning moments on the field, family gatherings, backyard dinners, vacations in California. I wasn't in a single frame. Not one mention, not a single caption. I stood frozen, gripping the glass tight. My chest felt like stone. The video ended to enthusiastic applause. Mom dabbed her eyes. Lana stepped up to the small stage with a mic. I just want to say, if Mom is the sun, we are the stars that orbit her. She shaped us into the best of the Carter name. Everyone raised their glasses in unison, like they had just heard a senator's speech. I set down my glass. What I felt now wasn't anger. It was emptiness. From across the room, I caught Brooke's eyes. Lana's daughter, looking at me. She gave a small nod, a simple gesture, but it felt like the only lifeline still afloat in a sea of forgetting. I stepped back, ready to leave, when Jake came up and gently stopped me. Don't go, he said, his voice low. You can stay for dinner if you want. I looked at him, saw a flicker of honesty in his eyes. Then I glanced at Lana, beaming among the guests as if this were her coronation. I didn't reply. I returned to my seat, but I didn't hide in the shadows. I chose a seat at the main table near Mom, not to reclaim anything, but to remind myself I existed. I belonged in this room, whether they remembered me or not. Just as I sat down, Aunt Margot, Mom's cousin, known for her gemstone collection and luxury vacations, walked over, holding a pale pink cocktail. Alice, it's been ages. So, what are you doing these days? I hadn't even opened my mouth when Lana turned her head, leaning slightly toward the table with a smile sweeter than sugar. She still does paperwork somewhere in a government office. A safe job, for someone who doesn't like challenges. The words floated out like nothing, but I heard each one clearly, like tiny needles piercing through my skin. A few of the guests chuckled. Aunt Margot let out a short laugh and patted me lightly on the shoulder, like she was comforting a child who failed an art class. As long as it's stable, that's all that matters, right, dear? She said, her lips still curled in a polite smile. Jake glanced at me, then looked away, pretending to focus on his food. Mom stared into her wine glass, swirling it gently, as if she hadn't heard anything. I didn't respond. I didn't smile. I just tightened my fingers around the water glass and kept my expression calm. I've sat in federal meetings with national security advisors. I've traced dirty money across borders. I've stood in the middle of gunfire on the Texas border. But here, in this room full of silk tablecloths and golden lights, I was still the secretary. Just like when I was 15 and locked out of the classroom while Lana was honored on stage. No one knew I had just wrapped up a 3-month financial investigation with the FBI, bringing 3 bank executives to court. No one knew I had stepped into an apartment where a key witness had been murdered, collecting evidence because she trusted me with her last breath. But what caught my attention wasn't the laughter. It was Brooke's eyes. She was staring at me from across the table, head tilted slightly, eyebrows furrowed, like she was piecing together a half-remembered puzzle. Our eyes met, and I saw real curiosity. Not pity, not dismissal. Brooke put her phone down, something rare, and rested her chin on her hand, eyes never leaving mine. I took a sip of water, trying to pull myself out of the emotions creeping in. Lana kept talking. going on about a new campaign her company was preparing to launch on the West Coast. We're working with a global brand. If everything goes smoothly, we'll launch simultaneously in LA, Tokyo, and London, she said, her hand drawing circles in the air like those cities were just items on a checklist. People clapped. My stepfather nodded in approval, pouring more wine into Lana's glass. Such a brilliant daughter, he said loudly. Any parent would be proud to have a child like that. I set my water glass down, still calm. And Alice, another relative, chimed in. Uncle Frank, my father's younger brother, you're still in that small apartment near the harbor, right? That rental place? Peaceful, isn't it? Lana chuckled lightly and turned toward me. That apartment's very cozy. Not big, but just right for a secretary's salary. I didn't answer, but I looked her straight in the eye. Not angry, not hurt, just the steady gaze of someone who knows exactly who she is and chooses silence not because she has nothing to say, but because she no longer needs to prove anything. Brooke was still watching me, as if waiting for the moment I would finally reveal the truth. My mother cleared her throat and folded her hands in her lap. As long as you're all happy, that's the greatest gift for me. That sentence, if it had come from the heart, should have been said 6 years earlier. Dinner continued with the clink of cutlery on porcelain, laughter, and toasts. I ate slowly, tasting the lemon sauce on the fish as a way to stay grounded. No one asked me another question, but I knew someone would, and that someone was sitting directly across from me, about to do what no adult in this room had ever had the courage to do with me. Glasses clinked together as Lana raised her crystal flute, her smile sparkling like the chandelier above. And finally, she said, her voice confident and clear, thank you, Mom, for always being the inspiration that shaped me into the strong woman I am today. Let's all raise a glass to Mrs. Carter, an icon of grace and resilience. Everyone at the table shouted, cheers! Wine shimmered and applause echoed through the room. Jake whistled. Aunt Margot snapped photos nonstop on her phone. I had just set down my glass and was quietly standing up to get some air when a clear young voice rang out. Not loud, but enough to freeze the entire room. Miss Alice, are you the one who caught Secretary Green? I saw you on TV last year. The entire room went silent. Lana flinched, her grip tightening on her glass so hard that red wine splashed out. The glass fell to the marble floor and shattered. My mother froze, her hands stuck mid-reach for her napkin, eyes locked on Brooke in disbelief. My stepfather turned to look at me, squinting. Jake stood still, fork in midair. No sound, just Brooke, eyes bright, staring at me with pure admiration that made my throat tighten. I looked around the table. The same faces that once radiated smugness and contempt were now stunned, confused, waiting for me to deny it. I took a deep breath. That's enough, I said, my voice steady and low. I stood, placing both hands on the table like anchoring everyone's attention. You want the truth? No one replied, but the air in the room felt frozen, waiting for a spark. Lana was the first to speak, her voice breaking. What's she talking about? Alice, don't tell me you... Yes, I cut her off, eyes fixed on my mother. I was part of the task force that brought down Secretary Green, and that's not the only thing I've done. Aunt Margot exhaled sharply, almost dropping her clutch. Jake opened his mouth to say something, then fell silent. I work for the FBI, I continued. For the past 12 years, I've been a special agent investigating cases of money laundering, government corruption, and federal-level trafficking. I've served on the counterintelligence team in D.C., took a bullet during an op in Texas, and spent the last 3 years dismantling a financial network tied to high-ranking officials. Lana gave a weak laugh, her voice shaky. You're joking, right? That's impossible. You're just an office girl. I opened my purse, pulled out a dark leather badge wallet, and flipped it open so the gold badge and seal glinted under the light. The words, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Alice Carter, were clear as day, unmistakable. The entire table went dead silent. This, my mother stammered. You're really an agent? I nodded. and have been for many years. But I didn't say anything because I couldn't, and because I knew even if I did, none of you would believe me. Brooke leaned back in her chair, mouth open wide. I told the kids at school you looked like that lady. They didn't believe me. I smiled at her. Well, now they will. Aunt Margot covered her mouth. Jake stepped forward, slowly, looking at me like he was seeing a complete stranger. You, he whispered. You did all that? By yourself? I gave a small nod. Lana stepped forward, her voice suddenly sharp. So? Everything you've hidden from us all these years was to play the victim, and now you show up here like some kind of hero? I looked her straight in the eye. Not to be a hero, for justice, for the truth, and because no one in this family ever wanted to understand who I really am. Mom sank into her chair, gripping the napkin tightly. Why didn't you tell me? Because you never asked, I replied calmly. You only ever listened to Lana. You only cared about the surface. I got used to living at the bottom. No one argued. I closed my badge and stood up straight. I didn't come here to prove anything. But if Brooke hadn't spoken up, you all would have kept treating me like a shadow. The air grew heavy. The background piano had stopped at some point. I stepped back from the table, eyes still fixed on them, and in that moment I knew every excuse had lost its meaning. Because truth, no matter how long it's been buried, always finds a voice. And this time, it came from the mouth of a child who was the only one who truly saw me. I held the badge in my palm, the chandelier's light reflected off the gold trim, making the words, Federal Bureau of Investigation, shine strangely bright in that tense room. No one said a word. Even Lana, always the first to speak in any conversation, stood frozen, staring. I'm the lead agent on Operation Echo, I said, my voice not loud, but clear and unwavering. I'm not the secretary you imagined, and I've never needed anyone in this family to lift me up. My mother sat silent, still clinging to the napkin as if it was the only thing keeping her from breaking down. My stepfather turned to look at her, as if waiting for her to say something, anything that could pull this back to the way it was. But she didn't speak. Lana broke the silence first. The public page, but could be fake. You're just trying to get attention. If it's real, why hide it for over a decade? I met her gaze. Because of the job, I said. Because of the lives of witnesses, my team, and sometimes my own. And because even if I had told you, you never would have believed me. I didn't speak out of anger, just a truth that had been buried so long. It came out now with the stillness of someone used to being ignored. Jake sat quietly, elbows resting on the table, hands clasped together. His eyes blinked quickly, like he was remembering something. Argonne, he suddenly said. Operation Argonne. You investigated that? I nodded. Jake drew in a deep breath and sat up. I remember seeing your code in an internal report. Several banks in our chain were audited that year. They didn't name the agent, but there was a tag. AC12No4. That was my designation. My mother lifted her head, her face wet with tears. You were a federal agent for 12 years, and you never said a word, not once. I stayed silent. There was no way to answer that without hurting her. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I didn't have a choice, I said. Security protocol, and I was used to not being heard. Jake bowed his head, fingers tapping softly against the wooden table. Lana remained still, arms crossed. Her face flickered between doubt and something else. Something less certain. So, all of this, she finally said, was just to prove you're better than us? To ruin Mom's celebration? I let out a quiet laugh, not from joy, but from the emptiness of that accusation. I didn't come to steal the spotlight. If I wanted to show off, I would have done it long ago. I stayed silent for the people I protected, for the ones who lost their lives, whose families will never know I was there. I didn't do this for glory. I did it to stop the bleeding. Lana didn't respond. Her eyes wavered, but she kept her usual guarded stance. Brooke sat beside her, still staring at me with wide eyes, so full of awe it almost made me forget I was surrounded by adults, too stunned to speak. "Hmm. You stood in front of Congress, didn't you?" she asked softly. "I remember reading an article about a female agent who testified before the National Investigations Committee." I nodded. "Last June. It was for Operation Pacific Ember?" Jake nodded slowly. "The International Anti-Money Laundering Campaign. My firm summarized that report in our finance brief. I never imagined that was you." I glanced at Lana. Her usual confidence was gone. Her eyes darted around like she was searching for something to hold on to. "I never needed anyone to believe me," I said slowly. "I just needed to exist as I am. Not to be applauded, just not to be erased." No one said a word. My mother sat slumped in her chair, arms wrapped around herself like if she let go, she'd fall apart. Jake just kept staring at me like he was seeing our entire childhood through one look. I slipped the badge back into my bag and returned to my seat. The glass of water remained untouched, as cold as the air that now filled the room. I didn't need to explain further. What they needed to hear, they had heard. The rest, they'd have to figure out on their own. I sat in silence, my hand resting on the glass, its ice completely melted now. No one spoke, as if all sound had drained from the wide room. The looks they gave me weren't cold or suspicious anymore, but filled with fear and quiet reckoning. Something in me pushed to keep going, not for revenge, not to hurt them, but to finally name what no one dared to say. I lifted my head, looking at my mother across the table. My voice was softer, but each word cut clean like a scalpel. "There's one more thing about Dad." My mother held her breath. Jake leaned forward. Lana furrowed her brow, her lips parting like she wanted to object, but didn't. "I used to think I could carry this secret to my grave," I said, still holding my mother's gaze. "But silence is its own kind of betrayal." I touched the necklace my father had given me on my 20th birthday, now dulled with time. Inside the pendant, 3 letters were engraved. T.A.C. Thomas Alexander Carter. Dad was involved with an illegal financial network within the military, I said plainly. He didn't orchestrate it directly, but he turned a blind eye for years. For old friends, former comrades, relationships he didn't have the courage to sever. My mother brought her hand to her mouth. Lana slowly shook her head, unable to believe. Brooke sat upright, eyes wide and unblinking. "It started when I traced a hidden account funneling defense contract funds into a trust in the Cayman Islands," I continued. "I tracked it for 3 months, and when the name of the authorized trustee came up, it was his." Jake lowered his head, his hands tightly clasped together. Lana shot up from her seat, stumbling back a step and bumping into the chair behind her. "You're making this up," she said, her voice shaking. "Dad would never—" "Dad knew he made a mistake," I cut in, my eyes locked on hers. "And when I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He only asked, is there any way to fix this without taking the whole family down with me?" The air in the room thickened, as if even time had to slow down to listen. Dad agreed to work with me. He became a witness in an internal military corruption case. We concealed his identity, used the codename Echo 7. He provided data from inside the system, data that opened the door for the case I am leading now. My mother started crying. The broken sob sounded like a blade slicing through everyone in the room. Lana said nothing, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes cracking like glass under pressure. But 2 days before he was set to testify, he died, I said softly. Everyone believed it was a stroke, thought he collapsed while walking through the park. But the autopsy showed traces of high-dose beta blockers injected under the skin. No one saw, no one questioned it. He had a history of hypertension. It was easy to believe. Jake shot to his feet, the chair crashing backward. "You're saying Dad was murdered?" I looked at him. No one says that out loud, but those of us in the field, we know the difference between an accident and a warning. They knew what he had revealed, and they weren't going to let him speak again. My mother broke into loud sobs. Brooke rushed over, clinging to her in fear. Lana stood frozen, her eyes stripped of all defense. I stayed silent, I said, my voice no longer sharp but weary, because I didn't want this family to fall apart. I thought maybe his death would end it all. I buried the truth, but the deeper I buried it, the more I felt I was betraying everything I swore to protect. Jake slowly sank back into his seat, holding his head in his hands. That's why you weren't at the funeral? Because I was handling security clearance for his files, I nodded. And because Mom said I shouldn't come. My mother looked up, her eyes swollen red. I didn't know. Alice, if I had known. I didn't answer. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a kind of exhaustion that sat heavy in my bones. After years of living in layers of shadow, maybe it was finally time to let in the light, even if it exposed things none of us wanted to face. I placed my hand on the table, exhaled, and looked around at each person in my family. None of them wore the same expressions anymore. Every mask had fallen away. And I realized maybe this was the first time we were truly seeing each other. Not as roles, not as expectations, but as people. As the truth, no matter how painful, begged to be named. Lana suddenly turned, walking quickly toward the door like the floor beneath her had begun to crumble. Her heels struck the marble with sharp, echoing clicks, but no one called after her. I watched her disappear behind the tall doorway, shoulders slumped, not a trace of her usual pride or confidence. She couldn't stay to hear the rest. Maybe she feared the truth, or feared losing the image she had worked so long to uphold. My mother cried again. Not the restrained, controlled crying I'd seen before, but a raw, unfiltered sob. She rose and slowly walked toward me like someone relearning the ground beneath her feet. I didn't move. My body still held its instinctive guard, but when she placed a hand on my shoulder, then wrapped her arms around me from the front, I found I didn't want to push her away. I was wrong, she said, her voice breaking in her throat. I was afraid you'd never shine like Lana or Jake. So I chose silence. I thought if I didn't speak of you, I wouldn't feel guilty for letting you fade inside your own home. I didn't say anything, but my arms weren't rigid anymore. Something inside my chest softened. Not forgiveness yet, but the first fracture in the wall. Maybe something that could heal, given time. Jake stayed seated for a long while before rising and stepping toward me. In his hand was a pale yellow envelope, its corners creased like it had been picked up and set down more than once before making it here. You said Dad cooperated, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. That might be true, because a few months ago I received a strange audit report from compliance. It involved a private military contractor I'd reviewed years ago. He held the envelope out in both hands, gripping it as if afraid I'd reject it. I'm not sure how important it is, but if it helps you finish what Dad started, then I want you to have it. I looked at him longer than I needed to. In his eyes was something I hadn't seen in years, regret. Real and quiet, I accepted the envelope. Our hands brushed briefly. No more words were needed. I opened the flap gently. Inside were 3 financial statements. An internal memo on letterhead stamped in red, and a handwritten note, probably from my father. No one knows I've kept these, Jake said. I didn't dare send them up the chain. I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing, but now, I believe if anyone can find the truth and still protect Dad's name, it's you. I nodded. No thanks or promises were necessary. When kindness arrives exactly when it's needed, it doesn't need to be named. A moment later, I felt a small arm wrap around my waist. Brooke. She didn't say anything, just rested her cheek against my side, then looked up and whispered, only loud enough for me to hear. I've always been proud of you. I used to wish I could be like Aunt Lana, but now I want to grow up to be like you. I turned, placing a hand gently on her back. Something melted inside me. Not because of the compliment, but because I saw in her eyes a choice. One made not from pressure, but from what she had witnessed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going in the work I'd done all these years, without a single glance of recognition from my own family. My mother still stood beside me, her eyes wet. Jake returned to his seat, hands wrapped around a glass of cold water. None of us knew what to say next. The air felt like it had cracked and was slowly finding a way to reassemble. And I no longer felt like the outsider, not because I had been praised, but because the people in front of me were finally confronting each other honestly, with no illusions, no performances. A family can fall apart from the inside without anyone realizing, but sometimes all it takes is a single breach made by truth to start stitching it back together, not with flawless thread, but with pieces patched from pain that's finally been acknowledged. I opened the balcony door to let in the late spring breeze. It drifted into the third-floor apartment nestled in an old brick building in Lincoln Park. On the round wooden table in the living room sat a tray of freshly grilled meat, a salad of microgreens tossed with apple cider vinegar, and 2 bottles of red wine from the corner shop I frequent. I never imagined I'd be setting the table for family in this space. What had once been just a temporary stop between long operations and stakeouts. The doorbell rang. I dried my hands on a towel and went to answer it. It was my mother, holding a bouquet of soft purple asters, the kind I used to grow on the windowsill back in middle school, though she never mentioned them. "I wasn't sure if you still liked these," she said with a small smile, her eyes glimmering with something lighter than guilt, but heavier than regret. "I still do," I replied, accepting the flowers with both hands. "Thank you, Mom." Mom set her purse down on the chair, then walked slowly around the apartment like she was truly seeing the place I lived. She touched the picture frame on the bookshelf and lingered a little longer when she saw the framed certificate from the Pacific Ember case, hung right next to a world map full of tiny colored pins. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. Next came Jake, carrying an old French wine wrapped carefully in a burlap bag. "Not sure it goes with grilled meat, but I figured it's worth a try," he chuckled, scratching his head awkwardly. "As long as it's not the bottle you used to celebrate that baseball win in 2006, I joked. Jake burst out laughing. "I swear, that bottle's long gone from the wine rack." Brooke followed behind, a large black camera slung around her neck, the strap printed boldly with Canon. Her ponytail was slightly off to the side, her face beaming. "Today I'm your personal reporter," she said, dropping her voice into a serious tone. "I want to capture the hero of my life in her natural habitat." I laughed. "I'm not ready for the Hollywood lights just yet, but if you can catch a shot where I don't look like I'm chasing suspects across a parking lot, I'll allow it." The room filled with chatter, the soft clink of plates and utensils, the scent of toasted garlic mingling with black pepper drifting through the kitchen. I laid the food out on the table and turned on some old jazz, quietly knowing this dinner wasn't about reconciliation. It was the first step forward. Just as I was pouring wine, a knock sounded at the door. I opened it, and there was Lana. Her hair loose over one shoulder, eyes puffy and red as if she had cried, but no longer shaking. In her hands was a file folder, wrapped in a cream-colored cover. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice rough. "I thought, if I didn't come, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." I froze for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, there's one glass left." She stepped inside and handed me the file. "I wrote a proposal for a nonprofit organization that supports students affected by school bullying. I don't know where to start. Can you help me?" I looked at the stack of papers. A rough draft, still unfinished in places, but with one handwritten line on the first page, for those once deemed too weak to speak. I pulled out a chair and poured her a glass of wine. "You can start with this dinner." Lana smiled slightly, soft, faint, but genuine. Mom sat across the table, watching the two of us without saying a word. She simply placed her hand gently over mine, a quiet acknowledgement. Dinner carried on with small stories, from the time Mom once ruined the seasoning in her famous stew, to the day Brooke got kicked out of the school band and cried in the restroom. Jake recalled how the three of us once pushed each other into the lake after fighting over the last cookie. No one mentioned the FBI, the case, or our father's death. We didn't need to. Not tonight. Just as I stood up to refill the water, the phone in my pocket buzzed 3 times in rapid succession, an emergency signal from the internal system. I opened it, eyes scanning the content quickly. Signal activity from satellite device in San Diego. Operation Echo reopened. Possible breach in Group 3C. I set the glass down and stood tall, glancing around at the familiar faces watching me. No one asked a question, but everyone understood. I have to go, I said, calm but firm. Jake nodded. We'll clean up the rest, go do what you have to. Mom stood and stepped toward me, fixing the lapel of my jacket like she used to when I was a child. Stay safe, sweetheart. Brooke raised her camera and clicked once. This one's for when you come back. I looked around the room once more. These faces that once made me feel like a stranger were now the ones that warmed my heart. Not because they suddenly understood everything, but because they were learning how to look again, with open eyes, not assumptions. I stepped out the door, my stride quicker now, but my chest no longer heavy. Each step no longer carried just the weight of an agent, but of a woman reclaiming her place in her work, in her family. Sometimes it takes going far and staying away long to return to the exact place where you are meant to stand, not for applause or recognition, but simply to be seen for who you are. Family can wound us deeper than anything, but it can also be the place where, if you're brave enough to face it, the healing begins. Sometimes with a belated hug, sometimes with a sentence long overdue. What about you? Have you ever been overlooked in your own home, just because you didn't fit who they thought you should be? Have you ever carried a truth in your heart, too afraid to speak it aloud because no one would believe you? Share your story in the comments below. Someone out there might be looking for the same kind of anchor that your experience can offer. And if you'd like to hear more stories about family, about broken ties, quiet strength, and how we learn to love again through the wreckage, don't forget to follow this channel. Because the journey doesn't end after one dinner, it continues right where the old cracks begin to let the light in.